Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting piece. It's a paper from back in February 2013 by Nadir Redzepi called Endless Learning Dilemma: What to Do When the Professor is Wrong.
Yeah, and this one, it feels a bit different from your standard academic paper, doesn't it? There's like a personal current running underneath it all.
You've hit it exactly. It really stands out because, well, the author frames it around his own pretty difficult experience. It was during an exam, involved racial insults, apparently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his feeling that the university just didn't handle it properly. So that personal frustration really became the seed for this bigger exploration of, the flaws that can exist within education.
So it comes from a really raw, real place.
Yeah.
That definitely gives it weight right from the start. And our mission today, I guess, is to unpack those flaws, those inherent imperfections in our educational institutions that Redzepi points out. We want to get into those tricky situations that learners, maybe like you listening, can find themselves in when these things surface. It's about understanding, like, what happens when that shiny ideal of education meets a messier reality.
Exactly. And just, put yourself in those shoes for a second. Imagine you're in class or taking a test, and something happens that feels deeply wrong, unfair, maybe discriminatory.
Right.
And the response from the institution feels lacking. What do you do? That core dilemma he faced: stay silent, try to switch schools, make noise, or just kind of lose faith. That's the jumping off point for the whole paper's questions about learning in these big institutions.
It really forces you to consider your own agency as a student and how the whole system operates, or sometimes doesn't operate. So let's dive into that central idea first, the learner's dilemma.
Okay, yeah. So the paper really puts the spotlight on that moment when you, as the student, hit a wall. It could be, like we said, unfairness, or maybe you fundamentally disagree with the material or how it's taught. What are your actual options?
And Redzepi lays out a few paths, right? There's staying quiet, just trying to push through.
Yep.
There's looking for an exit, maybe transferring. There's speaking up, protesting. And then there's the perhaps more corrosive option of just losing trust in the whole setup.
And the key thing the author emphasizes is that none of these are easy choices. Every single one has real consequences for you personally, maybe even for your future career. It's a genuine bind.
Definitely. There's risk attached to all of them.
And Redzepi's own story really underscores that feeling of frustration when the institutions themselves, the universities, don't seem to have clear or effective ways to deal with these problems. It chips away at that fundamental trust, doesn't it?
It really does. Which leads straight into the paper's main argument, I think. That these incidents, these maybe seemingly small breakdowns or imperfections, they aren't just isolated events. They actively shape the institutions themselves.
Exactly. They contribute to the culture, the effectiveness, the whole feel of the educational environment. Now, building on that, the paper contrasts how we often think about education versus the current reality. What stood out to you there?
Well, it's this big gap he points out. On one hand, there's this almost like societal faith in education as the great equalizer, the path to a meritocracy.
Right, the dream.
The dream, exactly. But then you look at the reality, and Redzepi talks about a knowledge famine, which sounds odd because we're drowning in information, right?
Yeah, how does he square that?
Yep.
A famine amidst a flood.
His point is that even with all this data floating around, finding truly reliable, deep understanding that can be harder. There's so much noise and now so much commercial competition among universities themselves.
Oh, the business angle.
Exactly. And he uses that image, that really strong metaphor of the knowledge factory.
Oh, yeah. Tell us more about the knowledge factory. What's that about?
He sort of paints universities as places that are mass-producing knowledge or maybe fabricating it or sometimes just, reprocessing existing stuff. And he notes that, okay, maybe the top-tier places do all three. But the very fact that universities charge vastly different fees creates this stratification. It means the kind of knowledge and maybe even the quality of knowledge you can access as a student might heavily depend on, well, how much you or your family can afford to pay.
Wow. So the price tag potentially dictates the intellectual goods you receive. That really challenges the meritocracy idea.
It certainly does. It makes you question that optimistic starting point. And the paper also touches on something we often take for granted: that automatic trust we place in academic institutions and the people within them. We tend to see them as these beacons of objectivity.
Which, going back to the author's story, makes it all the more jarring when that trust is broken. And then Redzepi brings governments into the picture. How do they fit in?
Right. He discusses how governments tend to define the common good through education. They set curricula and standards to meet national objectives, which makes sense in a way.
What?
But the potential downside is that this focus on a single idea of the common good might mean that the diverse cultures and perspectives within that nation get overlooked or marginalized in the schooling system. Whose common good are we talking about?
That's a really crucial question. Who decides and whose viewpoints get left out? And in today's world, so interconnected, the paper raises another big question about education's role, doesn't it?
Yeah, this point about whether our education systems are actually equipped to reduce social conflict and build sort of global solidarity, especially when knowledge itself and economic forces don't really respect national borders anymore.
There can be a real tension there between national goals and global understanding.
Definitely. A potential mismatch.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. The paper breaks down the role of the professor or educator into 4 distinct layers. What are those?
So Redzepi identifies them as 1, the knowledge transfer, just passing on information. 2, the knowledge producer, the researcher creating new insights. 3, the opinion maker shaping views. And 4, the service provider meeting student needs.
4 hats. That's quite a lot. And the immediate question the paper poses, can anyone really keep those roles neatly separated?
Exactly. Can you truly wear only one hat at a time? And maybe more importantly, what happens for us, the learners, if those roles bleed into each other?
That seems critical. Like, if someone presenting themselves as just transferring objective knowledge is actually heavily shaping opinion.
Right. It muddies the waters. It makes it harder for you as a student to critically evaluate what you're being told and develop your own stance.
And this leads to another really potent point in the paper. What happens when a sort of conservative or very traditional way of thinking dominates the educational space, potentially pushing aside newer or diverse cultural and social ideas?
Well, the risk is that it creates a very narrow view of the world, doesn't it? It can stifle innovation and make the curriculum feel outdated or irrelevant to the actual lives and experiences of students, especially if they come from different backgrounds.
And then there's that classic classroom experience. The student asks a pointed question, and it gets deflected or answered in a way that sidesteps the core issue. The paper mentions the impact of that.
Oh, yeah. That can be incredibly demotivating for students. It basically signals that certain kinds of questions, maybe the challenging ones, aren't welcome. It shuts down genuine curiosity, which is the opposite of what education should do.
It fosters what the paper calls a fait accompli situation. Like, this is the knowledge menu, take it or leave it. Students feel they just have to accept the academic community's prescribed knowledge, at least for the time being.
You're forced to play the game by their rules, temporarily obey, even if you have reservations or alternative ideas.
Which might be necessary to pass the course, but the paper makes you wonder, what if the menu itself is flawed?
Exactly. Now, related to this, there's the idea of knowledge being temporary. I found this fascinating.
Me too. Redzepi argues that everything, including academic knowledge, has a shelf life. Can you unpack that a bit?
So the core idea is that knowledge isn't static. It's not some fixed monument. It's constantly evolving, being updated, sometimes overturned completely. And this happens on an individual level, too.
How so?
Well, think about your own memory. We naturally forget things that seem less important over time, right? Our brains sort of discard old data.
Like clearing out the hard drive.
Pretty much. But the paper also points out that there's an active suppression or discarding of knowledge, too. We choose, consciously or not, what to ignore, what to value, sometimes based on societal pressures or our own biases.
So learning isn't just absorbing, it's also filtering and sometimes actively forgetting or ignoring.
Right, and this ties into what he calls individual anarchy and hidden chaos. Even within supposedly ordered systems like universities, our individual curiosities and choices create these unpredictable paths in how knowledge is shared and retained.
Interesting. And it's not just individual memory, right? He talks about institutional memory as well.
Yes, the collective knowledge bank of an institution. And that can be incredibly fragile. If a university or a department fades away, its specific body of knowledge, its unique perspective, can just disappear.
Like that library burning down analogy you mentioned earlier, poof, gone. And then there are the big external forces pushing and pulling on what knowledge gets valued.
Oh, absolutely. Political ideologies, what the market demands in terms of skills, the constant drive for technological innovation, all these things heavily influence what universities research, what they teach, what gets funding.
Which explains the constant churn of reforms and changes in education we always seem to be talking about.
It's often a reaction to these external pressures. Which brings us back to that tension the paper highlights. the one between principles and profit.
The bottom line versus the core mission.